welcome to the Leadership Learned podcast, brought to you by the Inspirational Development Group. Each episode, we examine the behaviours, skills and attributes required to improve human performance through effective leadership. We discuss the latest thinking and issues affecting leadership from the boardroom to the classroom to provide you, whether you're a CEO, manager, graduate or student, with tangible insights to take away and use in your career and workplace as we go beyond the cliches to prove that leaders are made, not born. So one of the things we try and look at with this podcast are the less obvious traits that leaders need to be effective leaders. And today we're going to be talking about curiosity. Again, not something you naturally attribute to leaders, but something that we think is very necessary. Nigel, you've written an article about this. Tell us a bit more about why curiosity is so important for leaders.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that prompted the article, I guess. One of which is that everything's a bit weird. Things are not familiar. The problems we're facing are not problems we are skilled in solving from the past. A lot of them aren't solvable. They're dilemmas that can't be solved. They just have to be dealt with. We need to be coming up with new things. At its most basic level, curiosity is about finding out why in order to come up with a better answer. So for me, that's where we are right now, is we're faced with things that we have to be curious about because we don't know what to do. One of the points I was making in the article was that that's not what our leaders have been trained to be like. We haven't selected people for leadership on the basis of their natural curiosity. If anything, almost the opposite. We've selected them on the basis of their ability to stay focused and drive and go in straight lines. And the problems we face now in society aren't in straight lines. They're all over the shop. So for people like me who naturally tend to think in weird circles that sometimes overlap and sometimes don't, this is a great time for somebody like me, but I'm a freak. There aren't very many of those in leadership roles. Most people are much more inclined to action, whereas I'm driven to understand, not to do things.
And do you think there's something here about the sort of cliche leader who leaders need their vision, but there's almost like you expect them to have a tunnel vision, almost like, the truly inspirational leaders, they know what they want, they go out and get it despite what everybody says, and therefore being curious about what other people think and everything is not something that we would naturally see as being part of a leader's toolkit.
It is intriguing, isn't it, that the way people think is so fundamental to the way they do anything, the way they act, the way they behave, the decisions they make, the things they make happen, the relationships they build, yet it's invisible and we have no idea what it actually is. You think about interviews for instance. The way we select people for a lot of jobs is by interviewing them, which is like choosing to marry someone after a first date. That's not a very effective way of recruiting people, and yet it's still our primary methodology. So we don't really know how people think until later.
I wonder if it's around what we're curious about. So some people are curious around finding a solution for the business that they're running. They have a supply chain issue that they want to find a way to reduce the problem or shorten the chain. They've got a manufacturing problem and they want to find a new and innovative way to manufacture that particular part. Or are we curious about people? So I think when time and money create pressure on leaders, it's easy to look for solutions that are much more or less about people and more about process or product. Whereas what we're saying is to be curious about people takes time and energy, and sometimes we don't afford ourselves that time and energy because the pressures of everything else weigh upon us. And so we look for what's the quickest way to solve this problem. And of course, nowadays we talk about leaders needing to have their vision and a sense of direction. They need to be making money and shareholder return. They need to keep their staff happy. And there's 1,000 things to think about. Some of them are much quicker and easier to solve than others. And the people conundrum is the hardest part. People are beautifully complicated and ever changing on every minute of every day. Even though we have typical ways of being, we're never really quite the same because we're continually growing. And for anyone that is reflective, they're growing potentially at an exponential rate. So it's quite hard to keep up with those people. So as a leader, you've really got your work cut out to decide how much of your day, because there's still the same number of minutes in every day, how much of your time do you spend focusing on the solutions for problems, or on how you help you get to know people and who they are and how they show up and how you might be able to work more effectively together.
That thing about the intent behind your curiosity. Is it just to find something you can tick off your list, or something where you can quickly move to action? Or is it a deeper curiosity to understand why, so that you can make some fundamental alterations to the way you behave, the way you interact, the language you use, or whatever? They're both curiosity, but they have very different intentions behind them and very different outcomes as a result. So yeah, you're dead right. And that time pressure thing is such a factor in this, isn't it? And that curiosity takes space. We've engineered out all space from life, with tools, technology and information and data and meetings and all the things we do to cram into our day to avoid having to have any time to think. It's a worry. And I remember back in my days in education, and you'll remember this too, is that I often used to try and shut my door. In fact, I once had my door changed in the business school because it had a porthole window in it, and I took the window away because the window enabled people to look in and go, "Oh, you're not busy." I was busy. I was thinking. That's what you pay me to do. But if I wasn't actively doing something or in a meeting with someone, then I wasn't busy, and somebody could interrupt me. So I got rid of that, because when the door was shut, they were much less inclined to bang on the door in case I yelled at them.
So it reminded me that little kids ask lots and lots of questions because they are curious, and it's the why is that, and what is that, and often it's quite simplistic, and I often thought it was more about learning about stuff. But the more I think about it, little ones are curious about people as well. And if they're encouraged to have those conversations about what they've experienced and how they felt and how people make them feel, they make such different sense of the world. But it feels then, the next thing I read was an article about teaching, and they were saying they're looking to increase the amount of what's called PPA time, so preparation time, assessment time that teachers get. Something bonkers, like at the minute you get 10% PPA, works out to be something like, is it 7 minutes or 9 minutes a week to do all your planning and all your marking and everything? Wow. Absolutely bonkers. No wonder teachers have to work evenings, weekends and holidays. And they might double that to 20%, which, you do the maths, there's not a lot more minutes of the day. But it's no wonder that in classrooms, actually, the opportunity for students to ask questions and be curious gets diminished, because teachers are under such pressure to teach the curriculum and get everything done in the little bit of time they've got with those children. So it's no wonder when you leave school then, if you've had teachers who've been able to create the opportunity for you to be curious in a safe and sustainable way, brilliant. But if you haven't, maybe you've just not been exposed to that. You've not learned that skill, because it's definitely a skill to be reflective about people. It is a very different thing from being curious about how the world works. My partner's an engineer. He's really curious about how stuff works. I'm not. The rocket went up in the sky and it landed. Wow. Yeah, I've no idea how that happened. It's very clever. Don't need to know. Not remotely interested. Much more interested in why someone might think that going to another planet is really important for our future. Okay, that stuff interests me. So yeah, it's interesting.
But even though, I suppose that's the different personalities who can be curious in different ways about different types of things. But I was interested in what you're saying about children, and it's the difference between allowing that curiosity and accepting it. I mean, I've got a 6-year-old. He asks so many questions all the time, and my natural tendency is to say, "Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. Forget about it. Just shut up." The way one of my parents used to do with me. I'm not saying which one, but and I keep saying to myself, right, okay, this is important. I need to keep answering. I want him to be curious. I want him to go out and look for answers to things. And you have to put in the hard yards now to get the rewards. But I wonder if that's not always the way it was. We didn't used to be told that curiosity was a good thing. We used to be told the exact opposite, in fact.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, what Ronan was saying there about children intrigues me, because so much of this stuff seemed to me to be learned behavior, and we've we start out curious. Almost every kid starts out curious. But one of the things that during my neuroscience studies, I was reading about this, is that the nature of our questions tends to change as we mature. So we start out asking questions about something very specific, like who's that, what's this, what's that, and as we get to a certain age, we start asking the bigger questions about why and how, and then as we get a little bit older, we stop doing that because those things reveal ignorance, and that's not acceptable. You can't ask the really big questions because you should already know the answers. And if you think about that, when you move into leadership, now you've got a triple whammy there, because you're really, really supposed to know all the answers because you're being paid as if you do. That's how a lot of people equate that thing, is that I'm now supposed to be the source of all brilliance and knowledge.
So curiosity can sort of equate to weakness.
Yeah, in people's minds. And in society, sometimes it's portrayed that way.
I think in leadership, it's because it could be because some people feel like there is we have become the leader. We've reached the finishing line of leadership. We've got the certificate or the badge. I've done it for X number of years. I know what I'm doing. It's my style. It's my way, but it's perfectly fine. End of. Whereas the work we're doing in the youth sector is about saying to young people, there is no finish line. There is no end point. This is lifelong. You'll evolve constantly. And because the world keeps changing, and we talked about the VUCA world, now it's become banny, it's brittle, it's anxious, non-linear, incomprehensible. The world is, it's chaotic in some ways. So young people need to appreciate, and that's what we're working with them to say, is there's no endpoint. You're not a finished leader. You're a constantly evolving human being. And the more curiosity you bring into your life to find out how you feel about things, and over time you'll feel differently. When I was 22, the thought of doing assembly frightened the life out of me. Next week, I'll stand up at a conference. I won't think twice about it. So over time, they'll develop as a human being. So they need to be curious about themselves and then be curious about other people. And so when we stop thinking about leadership as it's not an accumulation of knowledge. Actually, it's a time spent reflecting, refracting, thinking, applying, trying stuff out, seeing how the world is today for us, then the pressure's off to have an answer, because there's no truth in anything. It's just perception. It's our observation of the world through our eyes. So I think, once we get our heads around that fact. So what the students we're working with in the Middle East, one of them is doing a high project qualification, and his title is it okay to be me?
Wow.
Yeah. Big question. And we might next week on our conference run a workshop based on exactly that and ask the leaders of schools, is it okay to be you? Who are you? How do you show up in the world? Where do you sit in the world? And is that okay? And huge questions, no answer, no right, no wrong. And what you say today may be very different to what you say next week or next year. But I wonder how many people are able to stop and take the time. And I think the pandemic created time for people to stop and think. And maybe that's why so many people change jobs or, change their lives, because they suddenly got this headspace to stop and think about, this is my one life. Oh, now I'm really conscious that I do just have one life, and we never know how long or short it will be. I was kind of brought into really stark reality. So I'm a bit curious now about, does this feel good for me? And if it doesn't, what might I do differently? It's interesting times. I do think, though, removing the finishing line as a leader can take a bit of pressure off from knowing an answer, and therefore generates a greater opportunity to be curious.
Yeah, certainly. Yes, it's such an important area. And the fact that, as you said in your intro, Matt, that this is not considered a key trait for leaders is part of the problem. It is an illustration of the problem, that something that is so necessary and so fundamental isn't even on the agenda. We're thinking about creating a leadership role or becoming one. So it's interesting. And the book that Ian Leslie wrote, called Curious, which I'm sure you'll put in the show notes, is very interesting in this, and it looks at the nature of our curiosity, and going back to Rona's point of view, what's the intent behind it, and how does that change, and it's not a leadership book. It's a book about life and people and thinking, but every page has something that a leader needs to understand and think about on it, I'd say. And one of the things he talks about is the nature of his friends' 10-year-old kids, and he got them all to ask questions that most were bothering them, and some of them were fantastic. One of them was, "Did you used to be a monkey?" Which I love. And another one was, "If I'm made out of a bit of mummy and a bit of daddy, where does the bit that's me come from?"
Oh, wow.
That's deep. That is deep.
I wonder how it is that we lose the ability to ask such questions. Is it when we think about creativity, kids are so creative, and somehow that is it that society's norms and the need to go to school and do exams. So because we stop being at primary school, where I guess there's more opportunity for project-based learning and more creativity is enabled. We go in secondary school, we start siloing subjects to pass exams. Some of the best schools continue to create really innovative and creative ways for that curriculum to be taught and developed. But for others, it's not. It's very much about teach to test to some degree. And maybe that's where we lose that. But just imagine if you went on an MBA and there was a module on curiosity. How cool would that be? If you want to be a great leader, you need to be curious. Let's spend time. There's a marketing module, and there's a finance and economics, and now there's a curiosity module. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day when I was an external examiner at Ashridge, one of the doctoral programs, there was an interesting piece that one guy was researching, which is what's the role of love in leadership.
Yeah, Marcus Buckingham wrote that book, Love and Work.
Yeah,
year before last. Yeah.
Can you imagine if you went into most boardrooms and saying, "How do you feel about love?" How many seconds would it be before you were tumbling down the stairs outside the building? And yet, it's those questions are the real questions, aren't they? It's important to understand which procedure tells you how many lines you should have on the floor in the warehouse. Somebody's got to know that. That's not going to change the world. The stuff that's going to change the world is a deeper understanding of human nature and how to get the best out of people, how to enable people to be happy and productive and successful and effective. Those kind of things. And we don't ask that stuff enough.
But again, do you think this is something we've touched on a few times before? This is a problem of a perception of the hero leader. You know, the dozen or so people in the world who are seen as the successful leaders who are out there and who have done things their own way, and you know, and they're called these hero leaders when they're probably more actually sociopaths or something, but we can't call them sociopathic leaders because that would mean something else. It's that perception that in order to be a successful leader, you have to be this hero leader type of person, when actually, for most leaders in every other business, it's about getting the best out of your people, and to do that, you have to actually engage with them.
I think some of it's on upbringing, so we tend to be a product of how our formative years play out and the opportunities we get exposed to and find in our careers. So some of that, I think, is around opportunity. But I was reading some research the weekend around educational leaders, talking about the absolute rise of servant leadership, and exactly as you're saying, Matt. So leaders, typically the most successful leaders recognize that they are serving their people, and in the way that looks in terms of, as you say, enabling, creating opportunity, distributing leadership, so it's not held at the top but it's shared, responsibility is shared, and therefore creating teams who are looking to kind of work towards the same direction and curious about how they get there in the best way, not losing sight of the people for the process or the outcome.
And I wonder if, you know, we've talked in the past about people, about if leaders needing to deal with people and it not necessarily coming naturally to them, you know, that actually could be something they find difficult. And maybe having that curiosity about people is a way of getting better at that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, in the end, the leader's role now, and it is probably different to the way it was when I was first one, is not to do things, it's to enable other people to do things. And that's a very different relationship. If your job is to be an enabler, a facilitator, an inspirer, a coach, all those kind of things, that's a different job to being a boss.
Yeah.
We do kind of engineer it out of people. I mean, so Ken Robinson's brilliant TED talk, which is still the most watched one, about does education kill creativity? And one of his points was that the way we've decided to do things in our educational sphere and later in work is so mechanical. It's based on an industrial model. So we group kids together by date of manufacture, as he puts it, rather than by any kind of ability or affiliation or anything that actually makes any real cognitive sense. We do it on that basis because that's easier.
Yeah.
And we do that in work too, don't we? We like to draw rings around things because it makes them easier to manage and represent on a spreadsheet. And life doesn't actually work like that. We can pretend it does if we like. It makes the mechanical people happy, but it isn't how things actually work. Things are not linear. Things you mentioned some of those words like VUCA and RUPT and all those kind of things. That the world has become ever more unpredictable, and that's not going to change. It's only going to be exacerbated over the next few years. It's become unpredictable and paradoxical and twisted and all kinds of other things that make it necessary for us to have the curiosity to understand what the influencing forces are. And one thing Ian Leslie talks about is the idea, in order to be curious, you've got to understand firstly that there are things you don't know. That's a difficult enough realization for a lot of leaders to make. Secondly, you've got to recognize that there are competing possible answers. So therefore, you've got to make some kind of conscious choice between various possible answers. That's scary, because now you run the risk of choosing wrong.
They say that the biggest skill we can teach young people is to be able to feel comfortable in uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so, and actually by the nature of coveting their lives so that they might not fall over or bang their heads or do these other things or take risk, means that they're not really faced with uncertainty, and they don't need to get comfortable with it, because we create kind of quite a secure and predictable world. ChatGPT is quite interesting because, of course, AI drive and development means that now education is going to be forced to change, because of course kids can get the answers to all sorts of things in a heartbeat, and the kind of technology is becoming more and more sophisticated. So how we assess why are we still assessing just what kids know and can apply? Are there new ways now of looking at education and saying, what do young people really need to know in the world? Why are we still hung up on the fact that they must learn 9 subjects in the UK, and there must be a science and a maths and an English, and there must be a humanities or this and that and the other? Who is to say that that's actually correct? And what does this world look like now, and what are kids curious about, and what's going to serve them well in their lives, that means that they can turn up in this complex world and thrive? And I think because there's no answer to that question, there are multiple answers. Of course, the people that create the educational curriculums don't want to get it wrong, because the hands of the future generations the lives of future generations are in their hands. So they want to get it right, but there is no right. So what do? Well, typically we just do what we've always done. We keep doing the same until something like AI crops up and people go, "Oh, we have 2 choices here. We shut it down so the kids can't access it, or we open it up and give them that opportunity, but then now we need to think about the consequences and what do we need to do differently." So this is dividing education at this very moment. The schools that shut it down, the schools that open it up, where do we go now? And I feel like next 10 years, they'll be forced to think about, are we really developing young people for the world they're moving into as adults or not? And I say we don't. So what do we do differently? Who's going to be brave enough, that brave leadership, to really serve young people and say, we need to give them the best opportunities in life? When your son's 20, think about how different the world will be then compared to how it is now. It's frightening. And so is what he gets in his school educational diet what he really needs? I doubt it. But, yeah.
Interesting thoughts, aren't they? I mean, because I read a piece the other day that was talking about how we're living in the age of stagnation, because all the great thinking has already been done, because we've invented all the things that we need to invent. Now we're just tinkering. And I kind of get where they're coming from, but given AI, that's a hell of a thing to think about. You think of just the ethical considerations for some of this stuff that we're facing now. Like, I'm constantly bamboozled in the house when I go into Google or Facebook and an advert comes up for something that Helen and I were talking about over breakfast. You think, hang on a minute, there's a spy in the but it is interesting because it changes the nature of the game. I've always thought it was interesting that our interpretation of what constitutes clever in the UK tends to go with seriousness. I think most of the clever people that I see around in the TV are stand-up comedians. And I think that a lot of people that are on the news being interviewed are idiots. They're the ones that society says are clever.
Yeah.
And that we associate it with that knowledge thing that Rona mentioned, that you think about mastermind. That's not a test of how clever somebody is. It's a memory test.
Yeah.
How much information have you absorbed and retained that is of no use to anyone much who isn't on that quiz show?
Yeah.
It's just bizarre. How did I leave school? Admittedly, slightly early, their choice, not mine. But how did I leave school, knowing the names of several hundred kings and queens of this country and who was involved in various wars in the 19th century, but not how to open a bank account or what a mortgage was?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not changed. I still didn't know how to do that either. I'm still not sure I do. Curiosity can lead you in one of two ways. Curiosity to learn more things, or what I would argue is more important, is not just, we can Google these things and find these things out, but curious about how people interact in the world, because as the world develops and we create rockets and different types of space travel and all technology and all the other amazing things, it's the people that make the potential of those things quite dangerous, because of course people can use things in positive ways and negative ways, and everyone will have a different opinion on what's positive and negative. But if we get to understand people more deeply and the nuance of difference, then how we interact with one another will be greatly enhanced. And I think that I didn't really understand the word difference until the last 5 years. Suddenly I look very, I'm different to people in millions of ways, and we're all so different. And it's so complicated that sometimes it blows my tiny mind. But the minute you start to think about, why do you think that so differently to I do? Let's be curious about that, and let's find out, oh, okay, now I get that that's how you approach things. To me, wow, the way you approach them is so different, and I can learn loads from your thoughts, and equally what I think is different and you can learn from me. Suddenly we're learning in, I think, more important ways by recognizing and accepting and embracing and celebrating difference, rather than being threatened by, oh, your opinion is different to mine. I'm not curious about that anymore. I just want to be right.
Yes, absolutely. I got to get a bigger version of my opinion and beat you over the head.
Yeah, exactly.
Like nuclear warfare. It is interesting. I mean, in the end, all of this stuff comes back to human nature. I find these days that every time I write a piece or research a piece or talk about something online or on a conference or whatever, it's always ultimately about essential human nature. Somehow we kind of discarded our understanding of human nature in the Industrial Revolution and replaced it with this mechanical version. And it's only now I feel like we're coming to remember, actually, oh yeah, people are all different. Look at them all being different. Oh, that means I'm different too. Good grief. And it's like it's a revelation to a lot of people in society now that difference exists. We need to get better at just accepting difference and actually valuing it, rather than just having a policy about it.
I know Wikipedia should never be used as a reference point, but I noticed that their definition of curiosity is it's a quality related to inquisitive thinking, such as exploration, investigation, and learning, evident by observation in humans and other animals. And I think it's that learning aspect of it which we're saying is the really important thing. It's the being open to what you can learn, and whereas you're talking about people being curious about other people in terms of what I can get out of it, as opposed to what I can learn from them.
Yeah. For the greater good.
Yeah. We've talked about it from a leadership perspective, but and this might be shot down, but is there a way that we can use that curiosity can help people being an effective follower as well? So we talk a lot about followership and how you can be effective.
Very good question. Yeah. And absolutely, because it's about understanding, isn't it? That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, because if you think about the leaders who we follow, understanding them and their difference, their motivations, their ways of being. It's often why I think companies do 360s or they do psychometrics, because they know all the things that we don't know about ourselves, we can't possibly imagine. And when you read a psychometric and there's sentences where we ask people to tick which bits they kind of reflect on as being accurate, and the bits that I never say that are wrong but that they don't feel land as comfortably, make them curious as to that sentence. Reality is normally that they are absolutely bang on sentences, and that person's just not gone there, and they've not taken the time to look and listen and find out. So yeah, if we, as a follower, when we understand those who we're following and the nuance of them and their lives, we start to understand how we can work more effectively together.
So much of that brings us into that whole area of role play, that in business so many people are not being authentic because they think, going back to something Ron said earlier, that the real them is not acceptable, or is not good enough, or is not going to be okay in some way. That actually authenticity starts with deciding that it's okay to be you. Otherwise, how the hell could you do it? And we do spend a lot of our time pretending to be what we think we're supposed to be.
And if we look at the leadership books now that we're reading, often they're around traits that people would not naturally want to expose because they feel like they make them look as a weaker leader. So think about Brené Brown talking about vulnerability. Rachel Botsman talks about trust, and really understanding what trust is and what it means, how it's earned, and the fact that it's not earned, it's given. And so how do you create the conditions where people feel like they can trust you? So, but some of these ways of behaving, previously people might have felt that they might look weak if they were to say that they found something difficult, or they didn't understand something, or to show vulnerability at any point. And as years go on, more and more of these experts come to the fore and books are written where people start saying, okay, maybe it is okay to be vulnerable. Maybe it is okay to not have the answer immediately. Oh, look, it's okay to ask my senior leadership team for their opinion. Whereas in the past, the senior leaders would have been the one that had to come up with the decision. They have to make it themselves in silos or in isolation. What I really loved, Nigel, was at the end of your article, you wrote those 4 particular questions to get people. And that's, I think, what has got me curious around, are we curious about people, not just about learning more things, and are we curious about the people that don't look like us? Particularly on social media, we live in echo chambers where we see people like us. I love looking at my partner's Instagram feed compared to mine. It's like 2 whole other worlds. What world do you exist in? Because it's so different to mine. The people we talk to on LinkedIn, the echo we get back, often of people will say LinkedIn is an argumentative place, and I think, no, I don't see anybody arguing on my LinkedIn feed. Well, it's because of the people that I'm connected to, and the who they reshare, and the articles they acknowledge, and all of those things. So, are we curious to find out about the people that aren't like us, and the opinions that are different to ours, and how comfortable are we with that difference? Are we ready to accept it and embrace it, and not necessarily own it, but just be okay that it's different, cope with that uncertainty and that difference?
So is there I've got 2 questions in my head and I can't decide which one to ask. So what I'm doing is asking neither.
Go for it. Go on.
So what I was going to say was, so how do we promote, build, encourage curiosity in ourselves and in our team? If we're saying that an effective follower needs curiosity, a leader needs curiosity, what are the things we can do is to make sure that that's known, and also to build it in ourselves?
That's a great question. I feel like my answer is, every time something feels uncomfortable, you should stop and ask why. Because we keep going and going when things don't feel uncomfortable. But the moment you get that sense of this doesn't feel quite right, or the way you've behaved, being really observant, first of all, and then stopping when it feels uncomfortable and exploring the why that might be. You have to be open to look, because often it's changes in people's states, their eyes, their shoulders, their body language, the words that they use. just gives you a hint that something's not quite right.
Mhm.
And if you need to be aware of that, you need to have eyes wide open and looking, but then just take the time to stop and notice and explore, because that's when I think the real learning takes place. And for people to know that it's okay to do that.
Yeah.
I guess there's limits to, we've got stuff to do, and if it was me and I asked you every 3 seconds about stuff, it'd drive me completely bonkers. But,
That's the advantage.
Nigel, what do you reckon?
Well, that's the advantage of having weak signal on your mobile phone, because you can always deny it that you ever. Yeah, no, it's true. I think that's true. There's a thing in there. There was a very good paper done by the Centre for Creative Leadership about heat experiences that explored some of that how growth comes from what they call heat experiences, from being exposed to being uncomfortable and prolonging it for a while. That does something to not just toughen you up in the kind of boot camp sense, but to actually instruct you in some way about yourself and why it's uncomfortable, doing exactly the thing you just mentioned, that sort of stopping and thinking, why is this so hard? Why am I finding this difficult? What is it specifically about it that I'm finding uncomfortable? Because if you're too general about it, you can't learn. If you can work out what the kind of gist of it is, then you might be able to learn something about your attitude, your behaviors, your kind of preferences and predilections, whatever it might be. And they recommend using that as part of leadership development, that you build those experiences in so that people are pushed into those situations in a safe space.
And there is a lot and we've talked a lot about using curiosity to look outward, but there is also the curiosity of looking inward and thinking about your own development. Nigel, you touched on leadership development there, and you need to be curious in order to want to develop yourself further.
Yeah.
And that's the only way you are going to get on.
Yeah, and that curiosity inwards is probably the more important of the two, isn't it?
Yeah.
But also much harder to do. You can't Google that bit. Yeah, why am I like this? That's the question I should ask Google. But that's also why coaching is so significant in this space, isn't it? That having somebody there that's going to hold up the mirror to you and go, what's all that about then? And force you to confront and surface some of that stuff that you might otherwise rationalize away or deny or just bury. There are lots of things that go back to the Johari window. There are lots of things about me that I would much rather not reveal to the world, although I probably can't help it. Opinions that I hold, or experiences that I've had, or things that I want, or whatever, that might not be acceptable in public, but where they impinge on my influence and impact as a leader, I have a duty to bring those things out. But that requires a level of kind of integrity, I suppose, or something, courage, whatever it might be, or just bloody mindedness that enables you to kind of bring that stuff to bear. And you've got to be comfortable enough in your own skin and your own position to be prepared to do that. And I'm not always.
The work we're doing in the youth sector starts, Matt, exactly at this point of knowing yourself, because I don't think that we can do anything with and for anyone else unless we know ourselves. Because if we do, we actually run the risk of doing great damage to ourselves, because we're not considering, we need to know ourselves first before we then consider how we show up in the world and how we interact with other people. And because we keep changing all the time, that's not just I'll learn it when I'm a kid and then I don't need to learn it anymore. It's that constant reflection. And we talked earlier about reflecting back. How do we see ourselves? And then refracting, when I stand in someone else's shoes, how might they see me? How I interpret my behavior can be very different to how others interpret it. I know that I just have a face when I'm concentrating that says I'm concentrating, and I know to my stepchildren it was a face that said, go away, leave me alone, I'm busy. And so I had to work quite hard at changing that face so that they didn't always run away when I was just concentrating. So yeah, knowing yourself first and being prepared to continually learn more about you before you think about how you show up in the world, I think would make for the first step of leadership development in our entire lives. And being okay with that, just being okay with, this is me now, and am I okay? It's back to that student's assignment title. Is it okay to be me?
I think that's a good place to leave it this week. Just to summarize, I think some of the things that we've talked about when we talk about curiosity, we're talking about being curious about people, in a lot of ways. For a leader, that's vital, because the people conundrum, as Rona said, is the hardest one to solve, and curiosity will only help with that. The intent behind the curiosity has to be right as well. Is it a deep curiosity to change, or is it just a light vagueness that's just going to get in the way of things because you're not really going to pay that much attention to it? Some people may fear curiosity can be seen as a weakness, but it's a lot more than that. It's about being interested in more than yourself, which can only be seen as a positive thing to a lot of people. It's about development. It's about being curious in how you can better yourself. So keep asking questions. Notice when something is uncomfortable or hard, and try and work out why. And use reflection to learn more and think about how you show up in the world. Just remains for me to say thank you to Rona and to Nigel, and we'll see you next time. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the topics discussed today. You can find us on LinkedIn by searching Inspirational Development Group, or email us on info@inspirationaldg.com. If you would like to learn more about IDG and the work we do optimizing human performance through leadership development, you can find us at inspirationaldevelopment.com. We'll see you next time.